Hello and welcome to our first podcast under the banner of UKGI Live. We have opinions, we have lots of insight, we speak to clients, we have case study scenarios that are anonymised that we feel it might be useful to talk about, just so as we can bring some of these to light in a different format that we might otherwise struggle to bring these things to market. So I'm Dave Anderson, Head of Technical for UKGI, and I am joined by Al. I'll let you do your introduction now.
Yeah, my name's Alastair Haughton, known as Al. I'm Technical Resources Manager across our two group consultancies. I provide the backroom support to the consultants from a technical point of view. I help to write what both consultancies publish, bulletins, hot topics, news items, maintain the manuals, but act as as a point of contact for anybody who doesn't necessarily want to have to pick the FCA handbook to pieces themselves. I get that delightful job.
I think, we've spoken about this for a while now, and one of the topics of conversation that keeps coming up, whether it's on our interactions with clients, whether it's, between our consultants and the scenarios that they're facing, is in particular in relation to customer vulnerability. It's very much a hot topic and something that we've called out in the work we've done in helping firms prepare for the Consumer Duty Board report, to evidence the outcomes that they've been monitoring and the information that they reasonably need to feed through into that board report as they're structuring it. And vulnerability is one of those key areas. I think you quite sensibly called out a while ago that rather than just looking at 4 outcomes for the for the duty, that perhaps is 6. Culture being something that features very heavily in everything that the FCA put out at the moment, and rightly so. But the other areas is vulnerability. And I know that there's lots of things that firms can and should be considering in relation to vulnerability.
Yeah, I think that the regulators, the FCA and the FSA before them, have a long history, at the moment a 24-year history of indicating that they would like to be able to measure outcomes of firms. I know that the Consumer Duty talks about outcomes for customers, but the regulators for a long time have talked about outcomes at firms, for firms, of firms, if you like. And I think as well as the 4 main customer outcomes under the duty, I think firms would be, as we've said when we've spoken about the board reports, as you've said, I think they'd be well advised to consider outcomes in relation to their own culture, firm's culture, and improvements in that culture, and improvements in the way they identify and deal with vulnerable customers.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then in terms of identifying the characteristics of vulnerability, do you think there's much moved on in terms of the main drivers of vulnerability being health, life events, resilience, which brings into it financial considerations there as well, and then capability? I think that's quite a black and white look at things, isn't it? And there's many shades of grey that that firms need to consider in how they approach it and assess these.
Yeah, there are. I think that what the FCA refer to and people who deal with vulnerability, what they refer to as the key drivers for harm and the pillars of vulnerability, I think they have evolved, and I think they will continue to evolve. And I know that we have planned a slightly longer session, a lunch and learn webinar session that looks at the key drivers for harm and maybe what firms need to do, the practical aspects of dealing with vulnerable customers and monitoring the outcomes, getting the outcomes and the benefits right, and what the benefits are to firms of getting that right, and overcoming the issues of communicating with customers. But to talk about that as an introduction is half an hour. To talk about vulnerability in any depth, it's a long conversation. It's a long discussion.
Well, you could talk about it all day, couldn't you? And then
yes, you could.
You'd have takeaways, and then you'd need to revisit to make sure that firms' approaches are evolving, over time.
I think in a 15-minute podcast, what can we bring to you today? What can we talk about? Well, I think if you look at vulnerability from a wider point of view and look at what maybe some ground rules, some building blocks, and some starting points, I think maybe vulnerability. I wonder whether firms, or it might help firms if they were to consider vulnerability a bit like they consider demands and needs. And demands and needs is about understanding what a customer wants and being able to pick up and identify what a customer needs, even if maybe the customer hasn't thought about that's something that they want. And I think that's the key thing for vulnerability. It's identifying a customer's needs. Now, anybody who works with customers in the insurance industry will understand demands and needs. So for me, that demands and needs thinking, that identifying the needs, is the way to consider not just dealing with, but identifying vulnerability. It's just being alive to the individual customer that you have in front of you.
You're right. It's starting with the approach to demands and needs, because you use identification of demands and needs to understand what the customer needs from the product or service that you're
Yeah,
providing.
yeah.
The appropriate treatment for vulnerable customers should allow them to experience the same level of independence and to take those decisions in the same way that a customer without that vulnerability, short or long term, they'd have that afforded to them. So give them the same opportunities as other groups of customers. I think you're absolutely right. That's a cracking starting point.
I think that may be a slightly different way of looking at it, a slightly different way of thinking about it. But that key question, what do you need? I think it is important. If someone on the front line dealing with a customer, talking to them over the phone, if that was a small commercial customer that was renewing a policy, then you might be confirming what their covers have been or what their desires for cover have been. But if they suddenly throw something into the conversation that says, oh, I've moved to a slightly bigger premises and now I've got some outside storage, then all of a sudden that might be a different need. Maybe the customer hasn't thought about, I might need some extra cover or some different cover there. And somebody who's good with the customers and knows their product will be able to jump in and say, hang on, I think you might need something different here. And that I think you may need something different, again, is the key issue. And it's about making sure that for those who are senior managers in firms or team leaders or team managers, it's about making sure the staff understand that they can ask that question or they can be alive to picking up what a customer might need. There's easy examples, and we're not going to go through them now, but there's easy examples of, is English maybe not a first language? Is there an indication that a customer isn't quite understanding what you're saying and they need to they're asking multiple questions? They're common examples of picking up some areas of vulnerability. We could get into discussions about situational vulnerabilities and is a customer vulnerable just because of the circumstances they are in? Some of the vulnerabilities that, for example, the lending industry might deal with are massively complex. Yeah. And unfortunately for our sector, they may well not need to get as concerned or be as concerned or get as involved in some levels of vulnerability understanding as other sectors would.
What's a starting point for firms then? So we think about it in terms of the consumer duty and the outcomes there. So if you look at consumer understanding communications first, is that first step for firms to think about, well, how are they currently and how will they assess the characteristics of vulnerability through the various customer journeys and customer touch points that they've got?
I think a starting point all the time is making sure your staff understand what's needed, and staff have a decent, customer-facing staff have a decent awareness. And that from a practical point of view, they know that they've got somebody within the firm they can go to if there is an issue. Once you get past that, and maybe firms are confident that their staff will identify vulnerabilities, it's how you then go about addressing that in a wider sense. And you can't really pick up an understanding issue too easily or necessarily. I suppose to take a step sideways, you need to make sure that your communications with customers are designed in such a way that either you can flex them if you need to, or that they are as clear as possible, as clear and understandable as possible. And ideally, you should test understandability.
It's a really good point you've made there. There's a client that we worked with that just through investing in retraining staff and reframing how staff perceive vulnerability throughout their client interactions, and then establishing that metric for recording those customer vulnerability touch points, they yielded a massive uplift in the number of vulnerable customers. So over the course of maybe a 3-week period post implementing those changes, they identified more vulnerable customers than they had in the previous 12 months. So that's, you're right. That's a step that firms could take that could massively help them prove the evolution of the outcomes, the changes that they're making under the duty. But when you say about testing communications, what are some of the key considerations for firms? How do they test that their communications can be understood by customers, including those with vulnerable characteristics?
Ask people that would either receive them. So you test them on some actual customers, or you test them on, if you're a firm that's big enough to have staff that don't normally deal with customer-facing things. If you've got an IT team or an admin function that doesn't normally deal with customers, then get them to read them.
Yeah. Do you think that's enough to ensure that they're inclusive?
I think that will help with understandability. There are online tools that will help you with ease of reading and will look at things from a reading age perspective, and they can help as well.
And the FCA themselves, they've put out some fairly decent guidance on this particular topic, haven't they?
Yeah, the most, I can't remember when it was now off the top of my head, but the most recent or the most recently updated guidance for vulnerable customers, or guidance in relation to vulnerable customers, is a document that the FCA continue to refer to. And to be fair, it's pretty decent. It contains some useful ideas or useful examples of good practice and not so good practice and areas for improvement. And that's something that the FCA is getting better at. But I think that the finalised guidance is a good start from the regulator's point of view. If you were to start to scratch the surface online of resource in relation to vulnerability, there is masses of resource available, and some of it is really quite complex. I'm not so sure I'd suggest that every firm needs to go out and do that, but there's resource available that will help any firm with its understanding of identifying vulnerability and how it might better tailor its appropriate, or its tailor its service and its communications in particular. And if they're involved in product design, and improve product design to make sure that they're understandable and as suitable for vulnerable customers as any other customers.
You touch on product design there, though, so there's many considerations for firms from the point of generating the initial idea through to development, testing, launch of the product, then the ongoing reviews, and then ultimately the potential withdrawal of a product. What are some of the key ways firms can adapt and change the way they consider vulnerable customers throughout that process, which then will align with the product and service outcomes within the consumer duty?
I think in the insurance industry, we've had product governance with us since the back end of 2018. There's good progress that's been made. The regulator, I'm not so sure the regulator shares that view to a great extent, but firms will have taken good steps. And we're talking about maybe product manufacturers here, or co-manufacturers will have taken good steps to make sure that things are more understandable. But I think that in making sure that it's as understandable for all customers, I think that's almost an impossible job. But firms have to do the best they can, and then ask themselves whether the best they can is quite enough, or can they improve it? And that's the process that we asked firms to go through when Consumer Duty landed, when we were talking about a gap analysis that would feed into an implementation plan. And the position that we're in now, the output of that implementation plan is maybe the start of your story for your board report. So that consideration of what did we do? Was it okay? Could we make it a bit better? I think that also applies to product design, product development. I do think that the insurance industry is making some decent steps, but it could always be improved. For me, it's part of, you have to think about from a wider point of view, maybe a spectrum of appropriate support. At one end, you might have firms being able to produce things in large print, or pointing people at software that will read documents to them if a document is on a screen.
Yeah.
Maybe you make sure that you can give people more time to understand things, or have a trusted friend, somebody with them on the phone, or when they come into an office to discuss things with them. Maybe firms could come up with maybe a menu, some kind of menu of interventions, maybe of stopping points where they would think, well, I need to deviate from what I would normally say here because I'm picking something up, and I need to just phrase it slightly differently. And you can build in those interventions into customer journeys.
We've seen some really good examples of that, where firms use software that looks for lag points in customer online journeys, and if they can see a customer has paused on a particular section of that journey for a period of time, then it'll prompt with access to call or chat online and give them the opportunity to ask any questions. We've also seen some firms that are prepared to provide documents in font that caters for, people with dyslexia, or even to allow them to perhaps understand and interpret the data and, the information in a more easily palatable format. Even stuff around firms that have spent time training not only their staff, but training their staff on how to interact and explain the potential vulnerabilities that customers can experience, including short-term vulnerability, and how they can link into features of the products that they may otherwise not realize they could benefit from. And that's done pre and post sale in terms of the ongoing support. And there's some really good examples there. What do you think about firms that perhaps have taken the approach as well that because of the austere financial situation that we find ourselves in, over recent times, there's perhaps a perceived element of financial lack of resilience and financial vulnerability in many customers that wouldn't normally present itself through a normal client business interaction from a consumer standpoint. Is there any mileage in sending out a post-sale link to support that's available and asking for clients if there's anything they can do to support them in a different way? It's almost positioning that vulnerability support in a different way so
Yeah,
clients won't
yeah.
perceive that they are being treated as though they're vulnerable.
Yeah, what I mentioned before, I think that's a good example of something that I can try and bring that to life with. Those things that I mentioned before, things that firms could do. If you were to ask a vulnerability specialist about, single interventions or limited menus of interventions, or even a comprehensive list of single interventions, they would see those things as almost going through the motions of dealing with vulnerability. To move to really meeting customers' needs and our vulnerable customers' needs, they would probably talk about a matrix of support that would consider different channels and different types of relationships, having an internal specialist, being able to signpost to external specialists. So what you just mentioned there is an example of a step from maybe what the vulnerability specialists would see as going through the motions and moving into a wider matrix of support that considers different things and post-sale detail about this is how we could help you if you need some help. I think that's a great idea. I think what the vulnerability specialists and experts would maybe like to see is standardization across industries, across the financial services industry, of how frameworks are built to ensure some kind of consistency of treatment throughout a distribution chain. So, in an extreme case that any one element of a distribution chain that picks up with vulnerability, long-term or short-term, is able to share that. I think that's shot through with some issues and practicalities, but I think that's a nice thing to hope for. And what you just mentioned is a good step down that road.
Yeah, I think so. It's aspirational and there's nothing wrong with that. And if in the short term firms were to take an approach of true flexibility in terms of the types of adjustments that they'd reasonably make for customers if vulnerable characteristics were presented, and then to record the adjustments that they made over time, they might land on their own matrix of what treatment they're prepared, they're able to provide for their customer base.
Yeah, I think that would be good for them and good for their customers.
What do you think about firms' responsibilities towards vulnerable customers in terms of, where they disclose their characteristics of vulnerability and how that information should be treated?
I think that can depend on the nature of the vulnerability. If it's a vulnerability that falls into a category of a protected characteristic, then you're into particular issues in legislation. You're into potential issues or certainly considerations from a data protection point of view under UKGI GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018. It needs to be handled sensitively, but I think that particular vulnerabilities or particular protected characteristics that can be linked to vulnerabilities, and mental health is an easy example. They do need handling carefully. And I think that will come down to the sensitivity of the training of the staff in being able to say, is that okay? Or is there any other help that you need? Maybe just that prompt might be enough for a customer to provide a bit more information. And then I think it's up to firms to make sure that they can deal with that appropriately, maybe record it appropriately. UKGI is a member of an association called the Association of Professional Compliance Consultants. They have a vulnerability working group. One of the suggestions the working group made at one stage was to say that, if we're looking like we might need consent to record something, then just say, are you okay with me trying to make a little note of that? So we know that we can be helpful when we're on the phone to you or when we're talking to you, because we think it'll remind us that we need to act in a particular way or to do something for you. I think that can be useful.
That's a good point, and it's important as well. So the way that information is recorded, if it's recorded in one system, let's say it's recorded in the customer experience system, that should reasonably be mirrored in any claims information, any claims systems the firm may use, any complaint systems, so that record is consistent across all of the software systems that firm may use in its interactions with customers. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's, in the insurance world, that piece of information, you'd almost hope that you're never going to need to use it, in the same kind of way that you hope you're never going to need to use an insurance policy, because
Yeah.
you don't want to have to make a claim, because that generally means that something's going to be pear-shaped. But, I think that it's useful, borderline necessary to have, to be able to make sure that you can get that right outcome for that vulnerable customer,
Mhm.
which is as good an outcome as it would have been for a customer who isn't, indicating any tendencies or any vulnerabilities, for want of a better term.
And it's going to be important that firms have access to that information and that MI so they can, evidence they can do that, because that's a requirement that the FCA have stipulated. Is a good starting point for firms to, ask themselves what metrics they currently report on in relation to vulnerable customers. And then, assuming they can meet the bare minimum requirements, that they can output a report that ring fences their vulnerable customer population. How granular do you think that data needs to go? Is it enough to perhaps have vulnerability recorded in relation to health, life events, resilience, capability, and other, or does there need to be a layer beyond that that allows a little bit more scrutiny and integrity of the data and better ability for them to showcase the adjustments that they'll make for those customers in those scenarios?
In a perfect MI world, yes. For me, 3 levels of categorization in absolutely anything you're recording is ideal. I'm not too sure you're going to comfortably achieve that with vulnerabilities. And I think that from a practical point of view, you might need to draw the line at the top level of vulnerability, so that one of the main pillars, and if it is other, brainstorm some examples of what other might be and keep them short, not too detailed, not too many, because it would give you beautifully granular MI, but it would possibly give you MI that you can't manage or deal with. I think the key thing is having something that does what that firm that we've dealt with did, which just means that they can identify it more often if need be.
Yeah,
Just make sure there's something there that's just enough to be able to pick it up when it rears its head.
and
That's
if
the
it
key.
is,
And that's what that firm did.
and if it is other, then if the need is there, that they can go and find out what that other was in relation to that particular customer. So they've got
Yeah.
access to that information. So it's
Yeah.
recorded.
And the more others that you get, the better the firms will become at building a sub-level of categorization underneath that other category. And I'm sure there's online resource that would assist with that as a starting point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Once firms have gotten to a position where they're actively recording those interactions and they can evidence vulnerability MI, what governance routines, what committees, what meetings do you think that information should flow through on its way up to the board, and how should that be, should that be evidenced by firms?
I would add this as an item to all of the other reporting that goes up through whatever channel it is in the firm. I'm not sure I'm a particular fan of creating other committees for the sake of it. One of the things I mentioned before in considering a matrix of support is an internal specialist. If you've got somebody who's done some training or got some experience or additional training and awareness of vulnerability, then if there are MI packs or reports being put together, then for vulnerability in particular, maybe that person needs to be involved in a similar way that somebody who in a smaller firm either deals with all the complaints or in a slightly larger firm is a reporting line for complaint handlers. They would see maybe the complaints MI to make sure that it looks right and it makes sense. So I'm not a fan of building in a separate channel or something different just for vulnerability data, but at the very least, make sure it takes exactly the same route through to senior management that any other MI and board reporting might take.
I think it's fair to say that there should be an SMF that has vulnerable customer vulnerability assigned to them as another responsibility on their statement of responsibility.
I think that's reasonable.
I think it's reasonable that like you say, appointing a champion for vulnerability, a vulnerability subject matter expert, is probably one way that SMF could bring accountability and cascade that out further within the business. And then I think there should naturally be a touch point with the consumer duty champion if that's another individual. So it just allows for expansion of the visibility and the various considerations as they relate to not just vulnerable customers, but the outcomes of vulnerable customers, and then more broadly the consumer duty and the firm's treatment and approach of that.
Yeah, and I think different firms of different types and different sizes will deal with that differently. As the FCA has said, there is no one size fits all. It's not a once and done. So things will differ from firm to firm. we've got clients where there's 5 people working in a firm.
Yeah.
They're not going to have a consumer duty champion that's a separate hat worn by somebody else. They're not going to have an individual separate vulnerability expert. Those things might be one person. Those things might be 2 people who are both the senior managers of the business, and there's 3 other people working for them. So
Yeah.
I think that it will differ firm to firm. For me, in relation to vulnerability, the key thing is that it's in the mix. It's something that MI and information and data is gathered about. It's something that MI is produced about, and it's something that is considered, and that MI is considered in the same way that many other measures and metrics in a business are reviewed. Yeah. At the very least, make sure it's in the mix.
Absolutely. And if it is one individual who's wearing multiple hats, it's being able to evidence the journey that MI goes on, that's ring fenced and has the vulnerability lens on it. So it's got an appropriate focus.
Yeah, I agree.
Al, I think there's many questions that we could go on talking about.
Yeah, vulnerability is a broad church, and it's a complex topic. It is a complex topic. But as I said earlier on, for me, the starting point is making sure you're getting that understanding right. And part of asking the customer that question and knowing the customer's needs, maybe just think about knowing the customer's overall needs rather than just their insurance needs, is a key first step.
Yeah, pragmatic, informed, and appropriate guidance and comment. Al, thank you very much.
Okay, welcome.
Good afternoon, and I'll speak to you on the next UKGI Live, perhaps.
Excellent.